Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Democrats and the media, but I repeat myself, are blaming President Trump for the violence in America. Both the police shootings and the violence that followed them. And I deliberately used the word followed rather than caused by or stemmed from, because the truth is the connection between them is manufactured by an organized group of radical leftists who are not only trying to take down the president, they are trying to destroy capitalism and our Constitution, and along with it, our republic. I've previously gone into details on that. They can be found in old podcasts at www.themikebatesshow.com. The police shootings and the riots are occurring in places with Democrat governors, Democrat mayors, Democrat city councils, Democrat police chiefs, and Democrat supporting police unions. And those Democrats are refusing to enforce the law. So how is that President Trump's fault? Listen to this 2-minute montage of Democrats calling for violence. Sure, a few of these are leftist commentators like Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon. Madonna is in this, so is Robert De Niro, plus a bunch of actors I don't recognize. But you'll also hear from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Maxine Waters, and Nancy Pelosi. So these are not the words of some fringe activist spewing hate from mommy's basement. These are coming from elected Democrats, 2 of whom want to be the next president and vice president of the United States. Listen.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
People need to start taking to the streets. This is a dictator.
You know, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
Enemies of the state.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
Do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless.
When they go low, we kick them.
How do you resist the temptation to run up and wring her neck?
The biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized up to the right.
I thought he should have punched him in the face. I said, even if you lost, he insulted your wife.
Yes.
He came down the escalator and called Mexicans rapists and murderers. He said, well, what do you think I should have done? I said, I think you should have punched him in the face and then gotten out of the race. You would have been a hero.
I'd like to punch him in the face. I said if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
Punch some people in the face!
When was the last time an actor assassinated a president?
They're still going to have to go out and put a bullet in Donald Trump, and that's a fact.
Look as his character is stabbed to death.
Where is John Wilkes Booth when you need him?
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
A Missouri state senator is under investigation by the Secret Service after saying she hopes President Trump is assassinated.
I will go and take Trump out tonight.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
And sadly, the domestic enemies to our voting system and our honoring our Constitution are right at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. And that should be, everyone should take note of that on both levels, that this isn't, they're not going to let up, and they should not.
If you think we're rallying now, you ain't seen nothing yet.
I want to give credit to the website cauldronpool.com for assembling that. And I want you to hear the Democrats' nominee for vice president one more time before we resume, this time in a slightly longer clip.
They're not going to stop. And this is a movement, I'm telling you. They're not going to stop. And everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. And that should be, everyone should take note of that on both levels, that they're not going to let up, and they should not. And we should not.
Kamala Harris said those words on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Now, despite the fact that you just heard those words straight from her mouth, both Kamala Harris and the so-called fact-checkers at Snopes, PolitiFact, and factcheck.org have all denied she said it. They claim she was supporting the peaceful protesters, not the rioters. But at the time she said that, the protests had already been taken over by the rioters. So there was no distinction between protesters and rioters because there was no longer a distinction. And let's not forget what Kamala Harris tweeted on June 1st while Minneapolis was being burned to the ground. She tweeted, quote, "If you're able to, chip in now to the @MN Freedom Fund to help post bail for those protesting on the ground in Minnesota." End quote. She was helping raise bail money so the rioters could be let out of jail. Now, she did use the words post bail for those protesting, but those protesting weren't in jail. It was those rioting who were in jail. Nobody got arrested for holding a sign and shouting. People were arrested for committing violence. People were arrested for committing assault. People were arrested for committing arson. People were arrested for committing robberies. That's who Kamala Harris was raising bail money for. The peaceful protesters didn't need bail money because they weren't in jail. Florida Congresswoman Val Demings, a Democrat from Orlando, acknowledged on Face the Nation that protesters have the right to peaceably assemble, something absolutely no one disputes. Well, except for Antifa, which doesn't think Republicans have the right to peaceful assembly, which is why they show up to disrupt them with violence. But in terms of elected officials and Americans who are at least half decent, nobody says people can't peacefully protest. Well, Congressman Demings went on to say that, quote, "Anyone on any side in any place who violates the law has to be held accountable." End quote. She's right. Anyone on the side in any place who violates the law does have to be held accountable. But that's not happening. Democrat governors, Democrat mayors, Democrat city councils, and Democrat police chiefs are allowing not just the protests, which they should allow, they're allowing the rioting, the burning, the looting, the killing. Hell, in some cases, they've not just allowed it, they've outright called for it, as I showed earlier. But Demings couldn't stick to the facts. She had to politicize it with a criticism of President Trump. Listen.
I understand the point you're trying to make here, but when it comes to the activists, and I understand how well-intentioned the protest may be, but there have been a number of incidents, including here in Washington, D.C., where the other day your congressional colleague, Senator Rand Paul, was encircled by a mob shouting Breonna Taylor's name. He said he feared for his life. Has some element of these protests gotten out of hand?
What I am saying is that in America, we know that demonstrators have the right to demonstrate guaranteed by the First Amendment. However, we are a nation of laws, and anyone on any side, in any place, who violates the law has to be held accountable. We don't condemn people who obey the law because of those who do not obey the law. We can do both, and we have done both in this America, and that's what we need to do. And again, we need the President of the United States to show some leadership during this situation, but that may be asking for too much from President Trump.
But Congresswoman Demings failed to say, because she knows most Democrats are too stupid to know it and most so-called journalists are too biased in favor of Democrats to even ask a follow-up about it, is that the president is not in charge of any city or state's police force. She blames Trump for not stopping the violence, but Trump doesn't have the authority to stop the violence. Unless he brings in federal law enforcement like he did to protect federal property in Portland. But he was condemned for that. Not just by the media, but by the mayor of Portland, who blamed all the violence in his city on the president. Trump could federalize the National Guard under Title X authority if he declares an emergency, or under the Insurrection Act if he declares the protests are rebellions, which they arguably are, since the real goal of Antifa and Black Lives Matter is to destroy our constitutional republic. But that doesn't mean Trump should do it. I'll explain when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. As I said before the break, President Trump could federalize the National Guard under Title X authority if he declared an emergency, or under the Insurrection Act if he declared the protests are rebellions. He could. And he wouldn't be the first president to do so, by the way. President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard in 1957 to integrate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, when the Democrat governor and Democrat mayor refused to enforce the law. And in 1962, President Kennedy did the same thing to integrate the University of Mississippi, when the Democrat governor and the Democrat mayor refused to enforce the law in Oxford. A year later, Kennedy had to do the same thing when the Democrat governor of Alabama, George Wallace, wouldn't enforce the law that required integrating the University of Alabama. In 1968, President Johnson deployed the Illinois National Guard and 5,000 regular Army soldiers from Fort Hood to contain the riots around the Democratic National Convention in Chicago when Mayor Dick Daley failed to suppress the violence. But at least the Democrat mayor tried. Unlike today's Democrat mayors, Daley tried to maintain some semblance of law and order, at least as it pertained to the convention. Remember, Mayor Daley famously ordered police to shoot to kill arsonists and to shoot to maim or cripple looters. I absolutely believe arsonists should be shot on sight. Looters, well, that depends on a variety of circumstances that we don't have time to get into now. It's worth noting, however, that many Democrats condemned from the stage the police and military's efforts to stop the violence at the convention in 1968. Just like now, Democrats didn't condemn the violence, they condemned the police who were trying to stop the violence. How many people know that? I'd wager almost none. And the so-called news media sure ain't going to remind people. Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey to win the 1968 presidential election by over 100 Electoral College votes. But his popular vote margin was less than 1 million votes nationwide. And George Wallace got almost 10 million votes. So don't use 1968 as a reason to think Trump will easily win this year because of the violence in America's cities. 2020 has no third-party candidate who broke from the Democratic Party, and the media wasn't nearly as biased then as they are now. But I digress. In 1992, President Bush used the Insurrection Act to quell the violence during the Los Angeles riots. In that case, the governor of California asked for the help, but Bush could have done it without that request if he wanted to. Democrat governors and Democrat mayors have a long and sordid history of supporting violent mobs and refusing to abide by their oaths to enforce the law and support the Constitution. So today's Democrats are not the first evildoers of their party. The president is limited in his ability to use regular military forces to restore law and order domestically due to the Posse Comitatus Act, an act that passed in 1878. It came about after the election of 1876, where Republican Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidency over Democrat Samuel Tilden by a single electoral college vote. And the Democrats cried foul, claiming they were cheated out of a victory and refused to accept Hayes' legitimacy. Gee, sound familiar? Well, that led to the Compromise of 1877, in which Democrats conceded the election to Hayes in exchange for Hayes promising to end Reconstruction and withdraw federal troops from the South. Federal troops had been used to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that Republicans had passed over Democrat objections that guaranteed constitutional rights for black people. Do you remember what those amendments were? The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment not only assured that former slaves were considered citizens, it guaranteed the rights of all U.S. citizens in every state, regardless of state laws to the contrary. It required equal treatment under the law. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed black people the right to vote. Democrats hated all three of those amendments. But they passed with overwhelming Republican support in Congress and were ratified with overwhelming Republican support in state legislatures. I'm getting sidetracked again, but I think these facts are important because nobody seems to know them. They sure as hell aren't taught in the public education system's propaganda schools anymore. And most people who may have learned it decades ago have probably long forgotten. So somebody's got to remind us of the Democrats' long history of racial discrimination, contempt for the law, and the use of violence to get their way. So I suppose that has to be me. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Bottom line is that the Posse Comitatus Act was the result of a compromise in Washington where Republicans agreed to not use federal troops to enforce domestic laws. Unfortunately, that led to there being very little Republicans could do to stop Democrats from imposing poll taxes, literacy tests, Jim Crow laws, terrorizing black families with their Ku Klux Klan, and preventing black people from voting. And that led to Democrats being able to mistreat black people for almost another century. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, which although Democrat President Lyndon Johnson signed, they passed Congress with far bigger Republican majorities than Democrat majorities. So even with the Posse Comitatus Act, Title 10 and the Insurrection Act absolutely do allow the president to federalize the National Guard to enforce the law when governors and mayors won't. But just because the president can federalize the National Guard and send them in doesn't mean he should. As much as I would like to see law and order restored, if Trump federalized the troops, then he can be blamed for any continued or escalated violence. And there absolutely would be escalated violence. Now, I realize he's being blamed for the violence already, but hopefully enough Americans understand that the primary responsibility to maintain law and order in the cities lies with mayors and governors, not the president. Although I have seen some people, including nationally known so-called journalists and elected Democrats, falsely state that the president is in charge of everything. Well, constitutionally, he's not. And if he tried, I'm sure those same Democrats would say he doesn't have the authority to do it. If it wasn't for double standards, Democrats would have no standards at all. So what is the cause of all the violence? Or to more accurately describe it, what is the stated reason for all the violence? I'll answer that question when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. I put a short post on my blog titled, "Why Did the Police Shoot Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin?" And the response was swift, vicious, and, as usual, based upon lies. If you email me, I'll respond, usually. Sometimes I'm too busy, and sometimes I won't waste my time casting pearls before swine. But I do respond to most emails. Mike@themikebateshow.com. But I want to address a few points made by an ignorant detractor who tried in vain to say my post was wrong. First, this is what my blog post said, quote, "We don't have enough information yet to determine why Jacob Blake was shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Remember, for at least a week after Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, the public was outraged based on what we were initially told by the so-called news media. But later evidence proved that Michael Brown was shot while committing felony battery against a police officer. So the shooting was completely justified, appropriate, and necessary. So let's save the outrage over Blake's shooting until after we know if we should really be outraged or not. What we do know is that in 100% of the instances, not 99.9%, but in 100% of the instances in which the race agitators have successfully instigated violence to protest the shooting of an unarmed black man in public, the suspect failed to comply with the lawful instructions of a police officer. The most effective strategy for not getting shot by the cops is to do what you're told to do. Don't fight. You're not going to prevail at the scene anyway. If it turns out the police were in the wrong, that will come out in court, and you'll be alive to see it. This applies to everyone without regard to race, creed, or color. For all you cop haters who are so quick to blame the police, do you know why the police must prevent a person who's resisting arrest from getting back in their car? The 2-minute video posted above has the answer. That was the end of my blog post. And then there was a video, which I encourage you to go watch, of 2 Pennsylvania police officers trying to arrest a suspect on the side of the road. He broke free, reached into his car, retrieved a handgun, and shot the police. Neither one of them died, surprisingly, but one of them was in a coma for 12 days. Well, I got several responses to that blog post. This is probably the best. STFU, whatever that stands for. Just kidding, I know my social media acronyms. For example, WTF stands for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, right? Yeah. So it says STFU with your right-wing talking points, you Trump-tard. What about Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Botham Jean, George Floyd, and Emmett Till? Well, I responded to her with the following. Breonna Taylor wasn't in public. Ahmaud Arbery wasn't shot by the police. Tamir Rice was armed, albeit with a replica handgun, but the police thought it was a real firearm, and they also thought he was an adult. Botham Jean also wasn't in public, and he was unlawfully killed by an off-duty police officer who was convicted of murder for the crime. George Floyd was resisting arrest. Emmett Till was killed in 1955 and not by the cops. So you're wrong on all 6 names you tried to use to refute my irrefutable statement. Get informed before you comment. That was my response. Did you notice she didn't actually address the shooting of Jacob Blake? Instead, she named a half-dozen people who she thought were killed by the police for no reason. If she is really that misinformed of the facts, it's no wonder she believes as she does. Like almost every Black Lives Matter supporter, she's ignorant of the facts, which is exactly as the Democrats and their allies in the media want them to be. So what do we know about the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin? Well, we know he was resisting arrest. That's been obvious from the very beginning when the video was released to agitate the haters who, for reasons I can't comprehend, don't believe what they see with their own eyes. A video that very clearly showed Blake fighting off the cops and refusing to obey their lawful instructions. And that rush to judgment while refusing to see the clear evidence that conflicts with the left's narrative includes the inmates who run the asylum that is the NBA and Major League Baseball. I can't believe the owners just allowed their players to refuse to play like they did. And worse than just passively allowing it, they went along with it and expressed their own outrage that the police would have the audacity to actually enforce the law. How dare the police do their jobs, huh? Oh, the horror. That first video we all saw showed the police did nothing wrong. So even the people who thought the video showed improper or unlawful conduct by the police were wrong. But what have we learned since the video? We've learned that Jacob Blake was under indictment for a very violent crime. Back in May, he had allegedly entered the home of his ex-girlfriend, raped her, stole a debit card from her wallet, and then stole her car, which he used to flee the scene. He was charged with felony third-degree sexual assault, misdemeanor trespassing, and misdemeanor disorderly conduct. But under Wisconsin law, all three charges carried penalty enhancers because they were connected to a domestic violence incident. And he had a restraining order that prohibited him from going anywhere near the woman. But on August 23rd, he did go near the woman. And it wasn't just to say hello. The woman told the 911 dispatcher that Blake had taken her car keys and refused to give them back. And dispatch was also told that Blake was under a restraining order that didn't allow him to be there at all, even if for good reasons. So the police were made aware of the allegations, the restraining order, and the fact that he had an outstanding arrest warrant. So Blake was no Boy Scout. And the cops were aware of all of that before they arrived at the scene. At first, the police tried to bring him into custody nicely. He refused. So they escalated their use of force, which is perfectly reasonable, appropriate, and frankly necessary. Blake violently resisted arrest, including putting one of the responding officers in a headlock. So they ended up tasing him twice. But both tasers failed to subdue him. Blake continued his violent resistance, so the police officers drew their guns. Also perfectly reasonable, appropriate, and necessary. But Blake still refused to comply with their lawful instructions. Blake ignored the officers' commands to stop and to drop the knife. He walked to the driver's side of his vehicle while the cops were still shouting commands. He opened the door, and as he was reaching in, Officer Shesky tried to pull him back, but Blake kept reaching into the vehicle, and at that point, Shesky fired 7 shots. At least one bullet hit his spine, and now he's paralyzed from the waist down. So we know that now. We didn't know that the day this story exploded across the country via social media and via the dishonest reporting of the activist press. But despite not knowing the facts, Wisconsin's governor, Democrat Tony Evers, fanned the flames of false racism when roughly 5 hours after Blake was shot, he tweeted out, quote, "While we do not have all of the details yet, what we know for certain is that he is not the first black man or person to have been shot or injured or mercilessly killed at the hands of individuals in law enforcement in our state or our country." End quote. Yeah, you do not have all the details yet, Governor, so shut the hell up. But he also said that what we know for certain is that he is not the first black man or person to have been shot or injured or mercilessly killed at the hands of individuals in law enforcement in our state or our country. Mercilessly, Governor? Really? Would you rather the police didn't stop Blake and got killed themselves? Actually, I bet you would, Governor. I bet you do value the life of a felon more than the lives of police officers. I bet you'd much rather see a cop die than a criminal die. Governor Evers, you're a disgrace. I wonder if Blake had killed one of the cops, what Governor Evers would have tweeted. Actually, no, I don't, because I know he wouldn't have tweeted anything. And I also know that no one outside Kenosha would even know about it. But when it's a black man violently resisting arrest and committing felony battery against police officers, the whole world knows about it. But they don't know all about it. I would wager you every penny I'll ever earn that if you surveyed the people protesting Blake's shooting, less than 20% would know he was armed with a knife. And I'd wager at least half of those who do know don't care. They still think the shooting was not justified. But Governor Evers didn't stop there. Oh no. He's got a race war to instigate for political gain. So he tweeted out that same night, quote, "We stand with all those who have and continue to demand justice, equity, and accountability for black lives in our country. Lives like those of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, Tony Robinson, Dontre Hamilton, Ernest Lacey, and Sylville Smith." End quote. Shall we take those people one at a time? Who are those people? George Floyd? Well, we've talked about his death extensively on a previous program. He resisted arrest and was so high on illegal drugs that it probably wasn't the neck hold that killed him. It was probably excited delirium that did him in. And Officer Chauvin will 100% not be convicted of murder for it. Manslaughter, maybe. And he should be convicted of manslaughter for it. Not because of his knee-to-the-neck use of force, but because he did it for more than 8 minutes. But if Floyd had complied with the lawful instructions of a police officer trying to perform a valid arrest, there would have been no violence necessary from the police at all. Breonna Taylor? Breonna Taylor's death was absolutely unjustified. But it didn't happen because she was black. It happened because her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, who was not a criminal and was licensed to carry a gun, shot at the cops before they shot back and killed Breonna. Well, Walker's response to their forced entry into the apartment was not unreasonable, which is why he wasn't charged with shooting a police officer. The cops executed a no-knock warrant wearing plain clothes. What would you do if a bunch of men in unmarked casual clothes broke down your door and barged into your apartment? Breonna Taylor was unjustly killed by police officers at her home. And the public's outrage over it is appropriate. But it had nothing to do with her skin color and everything to do with overly aggressive cops executing warrants improperly. Tony Robinson? In 2015, 19-year-old Tony Robinson was on probation after pleading guilty to armed robbery the year before. He was high on Xanax, shrooms, and marijuana when he attacked a police officer who shot him dead in self-defense. Dontre Hamilton? Dontre Hamilton was resisting arrest in 2014 when he managed to take the officer's baton and proceeded to beat the officer with it. Well, baton versus handgun, the handgun wins almost every time. And so it was with Dontre. Had he not violently resisted arrest, he wouldn't have been shot and killed. Ernest Lacey? Well, first of all, this death happened in 1981. Deaths that happened 39 years ago, Governor, don't count. I'm not saying Lacey's death was no big deal. I'm saying that after 40 years go by, it's too late to use it as an example to support today's allegation of systemic racism. Plus, Lacey wasn't killed by the police. He died of respiratory distress in the police van while being transported after being arrested. And 5 Milwaukee police officers were found guilty, not for causing his death, but for failing to render first aid to him while he was in their custody. Sylville Smith? In 2016, he fled from a traffic stop, was chased by the police, and the officer's body camera very clearly showed Smith turn back toward the cop with a gun in his hand. Smith had a gun, which he raised. So the cop shot him. twice. What makes this case a horrible example of systemic racism or improper violence against black people by the police is that even the prosecution stated in court that the first bullet fired by the police officer was completely appropriate, necessary, and lawful. The entire case was about the second shot that occurred 1.69 seconds later. And it was that second shot that killed him. And the jury acquitted him, Governor. That death was the fault of the dead felon, not the police. And while I believe skin color doesn't matter, in this instance it is germane that the officer who shot him was also black. Now, don't think I knew all those people off the top of my head. Obviously, I knew George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but I had to research the others. But why did I research it while the big media simply reported what the governor tweeted with no explanations or questions, as if it was the nectar of the gods? It's because I care about the whole truth, and I know to never accept what a politician says at face value. Everything they say needs to be verified. Because if there's a profession with a worse record of truth-telling than today's so-called journalists, it's politicians. It took me some time, but if I easily found out the background of those deaths, why didn't the big media? It's because they don't care about the truth. They care about furthering a narrative to elect Democrats. And if you think that's a partisan statement on my part, I ask you, if a Republican governor mentioned names reporters were unaware of to somehow support his position, would the press just run with it without looking into who those people were? Of course not. But when a Democrat says something, it gets reported without challenge. Before we end this program, I want to mention one more name. Ryan Whitaker. Who is Ryan Whitaker? I'll tell you who he is, and I'll tell you why you've never heard of him when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Who is Ryan Whitaker? People are rightfully outraged at the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. But most people are outraged for the wrong reasons. They're angry because they think she was shot by the police because she was black. She wasn't. As I explained earlier, she was shot by overly aggressive cops improperly executing a search warrant, something they've done at many white people's homes too, which have also resulted in the deaths of totally innocent people. But Breonna Taylor didn't deserve to be shot, so it was absolutely an unjust killing by the police. But don't forget that her boyfriend shot at the police first, and when they shot back, they struck and killed Breonna in her home. But they didn't go to the house intending to murder her. But what about the police shooting death of Ryan Whitaker at his home? Who? Exactly. You have no idea who Ryan Whitaker is. Why? Because it doesn't fit the media's race-agitating agenda. Fake news doesn't have to be false. Editorial decisions of what to cover and what to ignore result in a false perception of reality. And so it is with Ryan Whitaker. On May 21st of this year, so about 3.5 months ago, which was a little over 2 months after Breonna Taylor's death, police shot and killed Ryan Whitaker at his apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. Officers were responding to a domestic disturbance call made by Ryan's upstairs neighbor. It was around 10 o'clock at night. The upstairs neighbor had phoned in a noise complaint, and the cops took their sweet time getting there. So the upstairs neighbor called back, demanding to know why the cops weren't there yet. Dispatch said, well, is this a violent situation or are they just making noise? And he basically answered back, if I tell you that they're violent, will you come faster? And dispatch said, yeah. And he said, well, yeah, it's violent. So when the two police officers arrived, they knocked on his door, or rang the doorbell. I'm not sure it got reported which, but they then went to each side of the door so that they were not visible through the peephole. So when Ryan Whitaker, who had a gun in his hand, opened the door, the police shot and killed him. And they shot him in the back, by the way, because he was trying to put the gun down when he realized it was police officers. So Ryan Whitaker is dead. What was the violence in the apartment? There was no violence. Ryan Whitaker and his girlfriend were playing a video game on PlayStation. Ryan Whitaker is dead because the cops killed him. And it was obviously a bad shoot. The police had far fewer reasons to shoot Ryan Whitaker than they had to shoot Breonna Taylor's boyfriend and in the process kill Breonna. So why does everybody know about Breonna Taylor's death, but almost no one knows about Ryan Whitaker's death? Do I really need to answer that question? You know the answer. Ryan Whitaker was white. There are no political gains to be had by Democrats from telling people about Ryan Whitaker's death. So other than in Arizona, the media didn't report it. And that's why, despite the actual facts about what races are killed by the police, most people, certainly the people who support the Black Lives Matter movement, think black people are killed all the time by the police, while white people never are. But the truth is that the police kill far more white people than they do black people. And that holds true whether the dead guy was armed or unarmed. I went over those statistics on my June 13th radio program. It's online as a podcast at themikebateshow.com. I encourage you to listen to it. You think the so-called news media doesn't have an agenda? Oh, yeah. They've got an agenda. Now, having an agenda in and of itself is not always bad. I have an agenda. But my agenda is to share the truth. Because I believe if people knew the truth, they would vote the right way. Big media's agenda is to keep you misinformed. So you'll vote the wrong way. That they tell lies of commission and lies of omission to achieve that agenda is disgraceful and dangerous. You may not like my opinions, but my facts are well researched and accurate. As the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat from New York, said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts." I'm Mike Bates.